Now, one of the more interesting debates that the show The Mandalorian has brought up, at least in the comments sections of my last few videos about it, is just how much, if anything at all, do people in the Star Wars galaxy know about the Jedi and or Force in this time period, and in particular, how much do you think the Mandalorian himself would or should know about them, because in the show he seems to be utterly clueless in regards to them. And in case you're wondering, the show is set 5 years after the events of Return of the Jedi, which then makes it 30 years since the Clone Wars ended, where the Jedi acted as generals in a galactic-scale war. And before that, according to Obi-Wan Kenobi in A New Hope, for 1,000 generations they were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic, which is roughly 25,000 years. And of course, the person Obi-Wan told all this to was Luke Skywalker, who didn't know a damn thing about the Force or the Jedi, had never heard of them in fact. Even though he had heard of the Clone Wars, which the Jedi, again, not only fought in, but they led the Republic's army, and he was of course also the son of a former Jedi himself. This seems to right away imply that probably a lot of people in the galaxy don't know about the Force and Jedi if a young, eager for adventure Luke Skywalker has never heard of them. But a couple things to keep in mind is that Luke has never left Tatooine at this point in his life, likely has never even gone to any type of school. His aunt and uncle have probably taught him everything he knows. And the last thing they'd ever tell him about is the Jedi and Force, because they don't want to see Luke get mixed up in all of that. They don't want to see him end up like his father, and have purposely been withholding all of that from him. Now you might argue that Biggs or one of his other friends may have heard of and told him about the Jedi, or he could have heard about them randomly from someone else. But another important thing to keep in mind is that Luke is the everyman in this story. He's the one we the audience are supposed to relate to and go on this journey with, the one we learn with. For the sake of the story then, Luke should be clueless about the Jedi. That way when, in the story, Obi-Wan is giving him the basics, outside of it, we are getting them too. One of the next characters we then encounter in Star Wars is Han Solo, and he thinks the Force is just a bunch of mumbo-jumbo. However, he does seem to have heard of it, which makes sense because, as he himself says, he's been from one end of the galaxy to the other and seen a lot of strange stuff. He just doesn't think there's anything more to it. He likes to think the only one in control of his fate is himself, which makes sense considering the type of character he is. But it also makes sense that in his extensive travels he has heard of the Force, and no doubt the Jedi too. He may even know about their involvement in the Clone Wars but just doesn't care, or he doesn't believe the stories about the things they could do, which is likely the stance of a lot of people in the galaxy at this time, or in the time period of A New Hope, especially younger people, though Han would have been around 13 or 14 when the Clone Wars ended. They know about the Jedi, they've heard about them and the things they could do, but they just don't care all that much or think it's all a bunch of stories. These beliefs would of course be reinforced by the Empire. We even have Admiral Motti telling Darth Vader that he has a sad devotion to an ancient religion, and he promptly gets himself choked for that. But this is important because it really begins to show the stance the Empire has on the Force and Jedi, when they're likely trying to spread throughout the galaxy they currently control. They're obviously going to do everything and anything they can to either spread misinformation about the Jedi or to try to erase as much of their existence as they can. They're also likely going to punish anyone who talks about them, especially in a positive light. The problem with trying to completely erase them from history, though, is that they do have 25,000 years of history to erase, and in that time we're involved in several, if not almost every, major galactic-scale war beyond just the Clone Wars that we see them in. Not to mention, they were almost undoubtedly involved in other galactic-scale events over the generations, and even relatively recent ones. In other words, their history is intertwined with the history of the galaxy. I mean, though we the fans don't have much information about the time period immediately preceding the prequel trilogy, the 1,000 years when the Sith were gone and the Jedi could do their own thing, that doesn't mean the galaxy doesn't know a great deal about that time period in general, or what the Jedi were up to. I'm sure a lot of average citizens in the Republic during the events of the Phantom Menace would have heard of the trade disputes and about the ongoing blockade of Naboo. It was a huge issue in the Galactic Senate, after all. They likely also would have heard that the Jedi got involved and helped liberate the planet from the clutches of the Trade Federation. This would have made the news, if you will, as would a lot of other things the Jedi got themselves involved in. And again, there's all that history many would have been taught. My point is that before the rise of the Empire, your average citizen of the Republic would have heard of and known about the Jedi. They would have been taught and brought up in schools. They would have constantly been making the galactic news. Their existence would almost certainly be common knowledge to most people. Even young Anakin Skywalker living as a slave on Tatooine knew about the Jedi. Hell, Watto knew his people were immune to mind tricks. You also have the fact that the main Jedi temple was just a few miles away from the Senate building on Coruscant. They're very much ingrained in society during this time period. However, this doesn't mean that the average person or citizen of the Republic who knew of the Jedi believed the things they could do, or that they knew about or believed in the Force either. It just means they'd almost certainly heard of the Jedi and basically knew what their role in the Republic was. We also have to keep in mind there are countless inhabited planets in the Star Wars galaxy, and not all of them are either in the Republic or even all that interconnected to the rest of the galaxy. So in the grand scheme of things, there are no doubt a lot of people, mainly living on more backwater planets you could call them, who have never heard of the Jedi or have heard of them but don't know much about them or don't even care to. You'd also have a lot of worlds or species that have their own beliefs or religions that would reject the Jedi and their ways and would not speak of them or teach them to their children. Also, there are only 10,000 Jedi during the time period of the prequels, which means the vast majority of people in the galaxy are never ever going to encounter one in person, though again, they're likely going to see or hear of them on the Holo News. And speaking of that, during the Clone Wars then, I'd say it'd be very hard not to have heard of the Jedi. The war would have been talked about daily, and not only were they the leaders of the Grand Army of the Republic, but they would have been used as propaganda by both sides, the Republic using them to boost morale, while the Separatists painted them in a different light. And even if living on a planet in the Republic not directly impacted by the war, it would have been very hard not to hear anything about it in the 3 years it raged on. There's also the fact that in his speech proclaiming himself Emperor, Palpatine names the Jedi as traitors, and something tells me a lot of people across the galaxy would have seen that speech. And so I think the question then becomes, how effectively could the Empire erase 25,000 years of information and history about the Jedi spread across the galaxy in the 25 years they controlled that galaxy? Well, if we're being honest about it, not very well, I'd imagine, considering how much information would have just been out there in general. They could certainly try to, and they did try to, reframe history and paint the Jedi in a negative way, as betrayers in the end, and they can make it illegal to talk about them in a positive way in public settings or to teach them in schools. And as I mentioned before, I'm sure a lot of people born and raised during the reign of the Empire would have had their doubts about the Jedi, or just wouldn't care so much about them. But really, 25 years of the Empire is not a long time in the grand scheme of things. When gone, you'd still have a lot of people who clearly remember the way things were before the Clone Wars and the rise of that Empire. They wouldn't have forgotten about the Jedi. They may not talk about them anymore during the reign of the Empire. They may even believe the propaganda that's being spread and think differently of them. They may then not be actively teaching the next generation about them. They may also have never believed all of the stories about them in the first place or what they could do. But that word or name, and what place they had in the Republic once upon a time, wouldn't have been so quickly forgotten. Then, during the Galactic Civil War, stories about Luke Skywalker and the return of the Jedi no doubt would have spread across the galaxy fairly quickly. His name and the things he could do or was doing was certainly being used as propaganda to recruit people to join the rebellion, and after the Empire did fall, he became a legend. Luke himself even says this in The Last Jedi. It was part of the reason he exiled himself. Also, at the end of that movie, his sacrifice is meant to help inspire and rebuild a new rebellion to rise up against the First Order. Slave kids on Canto Bight are even making Luke action figures and telling stories about him. We also can't forget Rey, who grew up on Jakku, has heard stories about Luke and the Jedi, but that she thought they were a myth. Okay, so let's go back to the initial questions. How much or how many people would know about the Jedi and the Force during the events of the show The Mandalorian, which is again 5 years after Return of the Jedi and 30 years after the Clone Wars ended? And how much or little, if anything at all, would the Mandalorian himself likely know about them? Well, I'd say pretty much anyone who had lived on a world affected by the Clone Wars, whether they be Separatist or Republic, and is old enough to have remembered them, likely would have heard about the Jedi being the generals of their army, or the opposing army. Sure, that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll remember many details about them, or again believe the stories about what the Jedi could do, but they would have heard that word, as would most people who have a basic understanding of history, because again of how intertwined they would be in the history of the galaxy. I mean, think about World War II that ended roughly 75 years ago now, and most likely you watching this now weren't alive and thus have no direct memory of it, and you may know next to nothing in terms of details about the war. But I guarantee almost everyone knows the name of the regime that ruled over Germany during that time period. And I don't say their name because, well, YouTube really doesn't like that word. But the fact that I don't have to say it, but you likely still very much know what I'm talking about, begins to prove my point. Some names and words just become famous or infamous, even if some or most don't even know the exact reason or details why. Jedi could have very easily become such a word for many reasons, and the Empire would have been better off continuing to insist they were the bad guys, that they had become corrupt, than trying to pretend they never existed. Again, that 25,000 years of history, most of which would be recorded, would be very hard to completely erase. That then brings us to the Mandalorian himself, who was alive and has some memory of the Clone Wars, whose parents died in it, who then gets raised by Mandalorians who have gone to war with the Jedi before, Mandalorians who seem hellbent on preserving their culture and would likely teach foundlings about their great history and how they fought the Jedi. And then we take into consideration he's been a bounty hunter for years, has no doubt been all over the galaxy and seen a lot of strange things like Han had. And speaking of Han, it was only a few years ago in the timeline that Han had been a prisoner of Jabba the Hutt, frozen in carbonite even, a tactic the Mandalorian now uses. And he was rescued by none other than Luke Skywalker and his friends. And I have a hard time believing the Mandalorian didn't hear about that, about a Jedi coming and taking out Jabba, even though it was Leia who actually did that. And let's also not forget how much Luke Skywalker would be celebrated for other things right after the war ended, how much his name and face would be everywhere, as would the word Jedi. Again, your average person is going to be hearing about the Jedi once again, assuming they somehow hadn't heard about them in reference to the Clone Wars or any other historical event. Even in the Outer Rim, where the Mandalorian spends a lot of his time, I'd imagine, there would be news about and coming from the Republic. Or again, he'd be hearing about how a Jedi helped take out the biggest crime lord in the galaxy. And look here, though I certainly understand and agree with the argument made by some that it's a huge galaxy and many across it would have never heard of the Jedi for one reason or another, if you're someone who is more, shall we say, connected, if you're living a standard life on an average planet in the New Republic during this time period, or even going from one world to the next hanging out in cantinas where no doubt current events are getting discussed, it's hard to believe you haven't heard about the Jedi in some capacity. That doesn't mean you're an expert on them, or you even believe they exist, but you've likely heard that word before. All that said, we have to go back to what I said about Luke in A New Hope at the beginning. He was the everyman in that movie, and now the Mandalorian is filling that role in this show. That's the real reason why he doesn't know about the Force and Jedi. It's so we can learn about it all with him. And even though I'd argue till I'm blue in the face that it's highly, highly probable he would know something about all of this, and that most average citizens of the Republic have heard of the Jedi, it's not impossible it somehow escaped the Mandalorian. And for the sake of what's been an exceptional show, I'll accept his lack of knowledge in this department. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. How much would people across the Star Wars galaxy know about the Jedi in this time period? Would they have even heard of them at all? Do you find it odd that the Mandalorian seems clueless about them, or does it make sense to you? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.